Welcome to the Sharing Without Shame podcast, dedicated to parents and anyone else who loves someone in active addiction. Education is a powerful tool in breaking down stigma, fostering understanding, and ultimately helping individuals and their loved ones navigate the challenges of addiction. With Donna Marston, author of Peeling the Onion and Sharing Without Shame. So take a deep breath and grab some tissues as we uncover the stories of love, courage, and unwavering support in the face of adversity, as Donna and her guests share their stories without shame. Because when we share our stories without shame, we inspire others to do the same.
Hello, and welcome to the Sharing Without Shame podcast. I'm your host, Donna Marston. I'm an author, certified recovery support worker, family recovery facilitator, and a mother personally impacted by my son's addiction. This podcast is a safe place for parents and anyone affected by the ripple effects of addiction. You'll hear real talk, practical tools, and proven strategies to help you gain the clarity, build resilience, and take control of your life. Grab my free guide, 5 Boundaries and Breakthroughs, in the show notes, and reach out when you're ready to create some change. Today, I'd like to welcome my guest, Mallary Tenore Tarpley. She is an author, a journalist, and a speaker whose work explores the complexities of healing, identity, and resilience. Her book, Slip, which will be released in August, I think August 5th, delves into eating disorders, recovery, and the subtle ways we learn to silence or rediscover ourselves. Mallory approaches mental health with honesty, empathy, and hope. Her writing has appeared in major national publications, and she previously served as a journalism editor and media analyst. When she's not writing, Mallory enjoys spending time with her family, speaking on topics related to wellness and self-worth, and mentoring writers who are learning to share their own truths. Welcome, Mallory.
Thank you so much for having me, Donna.
You're very welcome. Excited to meet you. First question I like to ask everybody is, what would you like to share without shame?
Great question. So, I would like to share that I am in recovery from an eating disorder and I'm not fully recovered. So, I've been in recovery for 25 years. And although I'm farther along than I ever thought I would be, I still slip and I still have to live with the imprints of my disorder, which still remains a vulnerability. So, I used to have a lot of shame around that, but now I really own that narrative and try to help other people to also feel as though they can share what it's like to live in this messy middle between acute sickness and full recovery.
Yeah. Well, like any addiction, I don't know. I know with drugs and alcohol, you're never cured. Is that the same with the eating disorder? Are you ever cured like for the rest of your life, or is it similar? I don't know much about eating disorders.
Yeah, so I really don't like to use the word cured when it comes to eating disorders. There are some treatment providers who I've encountered who will use that word, but I think that it can set some false kind of hope sometimes because there is in the eating disorder field a push for full recovery for everyone. And yet there's not really a general consensus definition of what full recovery is in the eating disorder space. And there are about as many definitions of full recovery as there are studies about it. So it's very confusing for people with lived experience to even know what that means. And it suggests that there's this finish line to recovery, when for many of us, the eating disorder remains a vulnerability. Some people do remain sick, but full recovery is very elusive. And there's different percentages depending on the study you look at. But percentages of some more recent studies suggest that about 20% of people fully recover. But again, I think those are percentages that are hard to really decipher because the ways in which we define full recovery differ so much from study to study.
Mm-hmm. So can you share a little bit about your journey, but mostly about your pathway to your recovery?
Sure. So I developed anorexia nervosa when I was 12 years old after my
Okay.
mother died of metastatic breast cancer. And when she died, I really, as a 12-year-old, didn't know how to grapple with that loss.
Yeah.
I tried to put on a happy face because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. So I went to school the day after she died and didn't tell anyone that she had passed away. I read the eulogy at her funeral without crying.
My
But
goodness.
behind that happy facade, I just really felt like my world had crumbled. And
Sure.
the more time passed, the more I felt like I wanted to just handcuff the arms of the clock. I wanted to really stop time. And I felt so far away from my mother. At the same time, I was taking a health class in which the teacher was instructing us about what foods we should and shouldn't eat, and was telling us about good foods and bad foods. And it made me realize that I could change the way my body looked based on what I put into it. So I had conjured this idea that maybe if I stayed the same size I was when my mom was alive, I could somehow be closer to her. And
Ah,
so the eating disorder was never about trying to be skinny or lose weight. It was really about trying to be safe and small.
mm,
And I didn't go into it thinking I'm going to have an eating disorder. I just really went into it thinking, I'm going to stay small. And I know I can do that by restricting my food intake. But that food restriction was this warped form of time travel that really quickly devolved into an eating disorder. So I was officially diagnosed at age 13 and spent most of my teenage years in and out of the hospital and residential treatment. And really, in those hospitalizations, I would get restored physically. So I would gain weight, but the cognitive distortions that accompany eating disorders were ever present. And it was really hard to shake myself from those. So I would end up leaving the hospital, relapsing, then having to go back. It wasn't until I went to residential treatment that I really began to make more meaningful progress in my recovery.
mhm.
And I was there for a year and a half, which is an incredibly long amount of time. It's almost unheard of these days, but was there
Wow.
for a long enough period of time that I could really begin to work through my grief. And I could begin to see the eating disorder not as the solution to my problems, but really as the problem itself. And
Yeah.
so that was really pivotal for me. Also, identifying who I was outside of the eating disorder and trying to reconnect with myself was
Mm,
important because the eating disorder had really taken over my identity to the point where I couldn't really connect with anyone. I couldn't engage in the activities that I'd once loved. Pretty much all of my life revolved around the eating disorder. So part of my recovery was thinking about who am I outside of this disorder? And in what ways can I be special and cared for and loved? And in what ways can I feel connected to my mother apart from anorexia? So that was pivotal for me being in residential treatment. I did go through a period in college where I relapsed, and there was a kind of decade long cycle where I was caught in this vicious cycle of binge eating and restricting. So my recovery kind of ebbed and flowed throughout the years. But then in my late 20s, I began to reframe my thinking around recovery because for so long I had stigmatized slips. And anytime I slipped, I would think, well, I blew it. I might as well just keep slipping. So all of those slips would turn into these slides. And I began to wonder what would it look like if I looked at these slips not as grounds for failure, but as opportunities for growth. That
mhm.
mindset was really formative for me, and it enabled me to get out of that cycle and to make meaningful progress forward. So now I think about the possibility that in this middle place, hardship and hope coexist, and slips and progress coexist. So I love this idea of thinking it doesn't have to be either or, it can be and both things can be true. So that is really how I think about my recovery. And I want to help other people to recognize that there is this middle place where you can lead a fuller life, even if you haven't reached full recovery.
Mm. Because it's never about the addiction of what you're doing or ingesting. It's all about the why.
Yes.
And getting to that what are you putting band-aids on that hurt so bad internally that people self-medicate, whether it's food or, drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it is, right? It's why.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so true. And really getting at that why takes a lot of just reflection and work and honesty, right? I think it's so easy to just hide what you're going through when you're
Mm.
dealing with an eating disorder or addiction, but really it's that secrecy that keeps us stuck.
So I'm assuming it was just your dad.
Yes.
How did he deal with all this? As a
Hmm.
parent, when your child is sick and suffering and you were young, 12 and 13 when it started, or 12 when it started, 13 when you went into your first treatment,
Mhm.
what was going on with dad? And
Yeah.
he's a widow and he's
Hmm.
mourning.
Right. Yes.
And yeah, mourning her and you.
Right. I know. And I interviewed him when I was writing my book and had a lot of conversations with him because I wanted to
That's cool.
understand his perspective more.
Yeah.
Because part of me for a long time felt some anger and blame just around the fact that he let me go to school the day after my mom died. And I wondered, why didn't he think it was odd that I wasn't crying? And he told me, he said, well, I thought that I had to be strong in the aftermath of your mother's death. And for me, strength is about just trying to move on, not crying. He said, I know
Mm.
that that's not particularly healthy, but that's how I operate. And so I thought that if you saw me crying, then you would just start melting down and we would both be there crying and not knowing what to do. So he said, I just tried to normalize things and tried to move on with our lives. But in retrospect, I think he realized that it would have been more beneficial for him to just sit with me and cry and tell me that it was okay to feel that sadness and to help me really work through that grief. But to my father's credit, he really tried so hard to get me help. He did not know what it was I was struggling with when I began restricting my food intake, and nor did I. I knew of eating disorders, but I thought that people with anorexia didn't eat anything at all. And I was eating a little bit. So I thought, well, I can't be anorexic. I'm still eating. My father didn't know really anything about eating disorders outside of the fact that singer songwriter Karen Carpenter had died in 1983 due to complications from anorexia. So he was under the misguided belief that only adults struggled with anorexia. So we were both confused as to what was going on. And when my father took me to the pediatrician essentially told us that my weight loss was just a passing phase. And my father didn't really know what to do with that. And so 6 months later, he ended up taking me back to the pediatrician because I continued to lose weight. And the pediatrician essentially said the same thing. So clearly didn't know much about eating disorders, if anything at all. And it wasn't until my father consulted a friend who was a nurse and she took one look at me and said, I think Mallory has an eating disorder. And so she recommended that he take me to Boston Children's Hospital, which was in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And he took me there, and then they very promptly admitted me to the hospital that evening. But he really worked hard to get me care and worked hard to understand the disorder. Eating disorders are so enigmatic. And I remember him on many occasions asking me, why can't you just eat? Or you're so smart. Why can't you figure this out? And those questions were coming from a place of love, but also just frustration and confusion. So a lot of
And
what he
fear.
had to do, right, was really try to understand eating disorders more. And this was in the late 90s when we really didn't know a whole lot about how eating disorders affect the brain and other aspects of our physiology. And so we had to kind of learn about the disorder together. And that was a big part of how we were able to really grow stronger as father and daughter.
Well, and back then, because when my son was in active addiction, it was in the late 90s, and you didn't talk about those things.
Mm-mm.
There was so much stigma
Yes.
that you just didn't talk about it because you didn't want to disclose that somebody in your family is sick and suffering. And it's almost like you have a scarlet letter that that people know. And I know with drugs, it's like, oh, they have cooties. You don't want to go near that family. I'm sure, I don't know if it's different with an eating disorder than, or you're treated the same way as what I was treated by people on the outside.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of truth to that, and also a lot of parent blaming, especially when it comes to mothers. I mean, I think mothers are often blamed for eating disorders. That narrative has shifted over time, but especially back then, there was a lot of parental blame. And certainly parents can influence their children, but in the case of eating disorders, they can't categorically cause an eating disorder. So there was a lot of that at play, and we really didn't talk about it very much. I didn't know how to talk about it with other people my age. And so I told my friends when I got out of the hospital that I had just had some heart issues, which was true because my heart rate had been so low from the disorder. But I didn't really at the time even have the words to describe what it meant to have anorexia. And I didn't think other people would understand.
I mean, you were a teenager. It's like, how can you have all that knowledge? Because I'm sure you don't understand what's going on with your body or your mind or everything that's happening.
Mhm.
My goodness.
Yeah, it was a
So
really hard
moving
time.
forward, how long did this go? Well, you went through college and then it's still ongoing from, if I heard you correctly. What has your journey been through all of this? And now you're a mom, you have
Mhm.
children, and you've written a book called Slip. And how did you get there from there to where you are today, being an author?
Hmm. So, as I was thinking about my own experiences with anorexia, I began to find myself wanting to write about those experiences. But what I found was that those narratives that I was telling in various essays and stories that I was publishing were really based in half truths because very often I would be writing about my eating disorder as something that was part of my past, but not my present. And I would say, oh, well, I had anorexia. I struggled with anorexia. I was really using the past tense because I was too fearful of admitting that I still grappled with the imprints of the disorder. And so those narratives felt inauthentic to me in a lot of ways. And whenever I would read books about eating disorders, although many of them were helpful, they by and large were told from the perspective of people who were fully recovered. And it just felt like there was this lack of a mirrored image there where I couldn't see myself or my story reflected in those books. And for a long time, I thought, well, I need to be fully recovered in order to write a book. I'd always wanted to write a book. And I thought, okay, one day I'll be fully recovered. And then I can finally be like all those other authors who have written about eating disorders and get my book published. But I kept kind of waiting for that day when full recovery would arrive. And it just it dawned on me that that day may not arrive. And what does that mean, right? What does it mean as a mother of young children to kind of move through this world knowing that I am better, but not all better, and knowing that I still do grapple with the eating disorder to an extent? Can I tell a story that authentically captures that reality while still offering up hope for people that recovery is possible, even if you don't or can't reach the fullest expression of it? So for me, the book was really about trying to think through how I could give language to this middle place, right? And so the middle place is just this term I came up with to kind of describe this messy middle that so many of us find ourselves in, whether we're recovering from eating disorders or addiction or even grief and loss. I think about this with regard to losing my mom, where I've never arrived at a place of closure, right? I still carry the load of that loss, but the load has lightened over time. So, in many ways, when I think about grief and loss, I think I'm also in this middle place. And I'll just say that when I first started writing this book, I thought that I was the only person in this middle place because nobody talks about it, at least not when it comes to eating disorders. But I ended up surveying over 700 people with lived experience with an eating disorder for the book and found that 85% of people said that they could identify with this middle place. And once I started interviewing individuals, so many of them said, oh, I felt so much stigma and shame around admitting that I'm in this place. So I just tell people I'm fully recovered because it's easier. Or I never had the language to really describe this place I'm in, where I felt too ashamed or stigmatized whenever I would even think about trying to let people know where I'm actually at in my recovery. So hearing those narratives was really empowering for me and just gave me motivation to write this book with hopes that in telling my story, I can help other people to feel empowered to do the same.
Are people really 100% recovered, or is it really just for today, I'm living in a recovered state?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, there are some people I interviewed who said that they were fully recovered, and they essentially said that they don't think about the eating disorder anymore. It doesn't dictate their choices or their thoughts, and they feel like they're free from the disorder. So I don't want to discredit their narratives because I do think there are people who are fully recovered. But I think to your point, there are far more of us who maybe are in a recovered state in a particular moment in time, whether that be a day or even an hour, right? Or
Right.
maybe a series of weeks, but we're not sort of fully recovered in the sense that it's a thing of the past that we never have to worry about again. I think that for
Right.
many of us who have had eating disorders, even if we consider ourselves fully recovered, there are still triggers we have to be aware of, just as
Hmm.
when you get sick and you maybe get into an energy deficit where you are essentially sort of burning more calories than you're consuming. That, for instance, can be a trigger for people who have had an eating disorder in the past. So I think even for folks who feel like they've arrived at full recovery, they still need to be really cognizant of the fact that these triggers can sometimes come up unexpectedly during pregnancy, during menopause, during transitions when our bodies are changing. So it's important to be realistic about that and have honest conversations about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Because, I mean, you just never say never because you don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it could put a lot of pressure on someone to say, I'm fully recovered. What I know of addiction, I mean, it's all addictive behavior, is this little voice shows up and just starts going, just telling you, oh, just go ahead, just do a little bit, you'll be fine, right? I would assume it's the same way with an eating disorder because the brain, my understanding of addiction is it's a brain disorder. Your brain's wired differently than mine. My
Mm-hmm.
son, his addiction was drugs. His brain is wired differently than mine, right?
Yep, I agree with that. I think that that's become increasingly clear just with a lot of the brain-based research that has come out around addiction and eating disorders, that there are these brain-based alterations that happen when someone has an eating disorder. And there are certain people who are predisposed to developing eating disorders. So that's important to understand too, because so often addiction and eating disorders are just relegated as being disorders of choice, right? You chose to do this to yourself, or you can
Yeah.
just choose to recover and you're not making good choices. But it's so much more complicated than that. And I have a
Yeah.
lot of empathy for my younger self because I didn't know at the time just how much the disorder was changing not only my body, but my brain.
Yeah.
And it really makes a lot more sense now as to why I got stuck in these cognitive ruts
Mm.
because of these changes happening in the brain. So the cognitive distortions are really hard to shake, right? Those thoughts that you were mentioning. I remember when I left treatment, I was in a period of kind of what I considered full recovery for 2 years. But then when I got to college, I was overwhelmed by schoolwork and my father was remarrying. And I remember just starting to get these disordered thoughts again. It was almost as if anorexia was knocking on the door saying, let me in. And I really tried to ignore those thoughts, but they ended up leading me to sort of engage in disordered behaviors. And we know that with addiction and eating disorders, that can happen, right? And so even though someone may be restored in terms of their weight and they may be healthier physically, they may still really be grappling with a lot of these disordered thoughts. And that's where we need to spend a lot more time and attention thinking through how do we help people to grapple with those so that it doesn't lead to a relapse.
Yeah. Again, getting to the why, putting it out on the tables and understanding why do you need to use food or self-medicate so it's like a hole in your soul and you're filling it with food or drugs or whatever, and it's just managing that. What are some tools or coping skills that you could talk to the person who has an eating disorder, but also to the parents or a loved one?
hmm So, a lot of this is trying to figure out a little bit more about what eating disorders entail. So, certainly, when it comes to parents talking with kids about eating disorders, you want to make sure that you've tried to read up on them a little bit, that you understand them to an extent, right? It's hard to ever fully understand them if you've not gone through them. But one of the biggest things is not approaching conversations from a place of blame, but really approaching conversations in a non judgmental and curious way, and in ways that will engage kind of conversation and storytelling, right? So I've noticed that it seems like you've been having a really hard time lately. I want you to know I'm here for you. And I also want to talk about that with you. Why do you think that is, right? Sort of asking these questions so that the person knows that they can come to you. Because I think that if a child kind of thinks that their parent is always going to be blaming them, or if they're going to be kind of making them feel ashamed, then they're not going to want to turn to the
Right.
parent when they have a slip up or when they're really struggling with something. So having those open lines of communication is incredibly important. And I think for those who are struggling, that communication can really help you to be able to move forward. Certainly, there's a lot of factors, of course, that go into recovery and progress, but I found for me that I, for so long, just hid my struggles, and I just struggled very silently because I was ashamed of my behaviors. I also just didn't necessarily want to tell somebody and then have to try to stop the behaviors, right? Because when you tell somebody, then they begin to hold you accountable, and that makes it harder to engage in the disorder. But once I began to actually confide in my father and my treatment providers, now in my husband, I just find that that is a way to really try to kind of keep in touch with myself and not let the disorder dictate everything that I'm doing. If I can think about, okay, I made this choice that was in service of the disorder. How now do I make a choice in service of recovery? And one of the ways I do that is by trying to really talk about slips when they happen, as opposed to just letting them kind of sit in silence.
Mm-hmm. And what about for the parents that are noticing that their child might have an eating disorder or know that they have an eating disorder? And what would be some coping skills? Because I know as a parent and working with families for a long time, we have a tendency, all in the name of love, to um, be hyper focused on everything we think you're doing wrong and not looking at that little teeny little speck of what you're doing right.
Yes, that's so important. And this is something I talk about in the book, how it's really easy to focus on what we've done wrong. And I think that that's especially true when we think about our kids, because we want what's best for them. We want them to recover. But one of the best things that parents can do is really try to celebrate small moments of success and to celebrate really small victories. One thing that I sometimes encourage parents to do is to think about engaging in an activity that will help them to really celebrate progress with their child. So, one example would be to engage in some sort of art project. When I was sick, I loved doing origami, and I would just make these paper hearts all the time. And I was talking about this with a parent, and she ended up then sort of beginning to make these little origami hearts beside her daughter whenever her daughter would make a choice in service of recovery. And maybe it was just a very small choice where maybe she decided that she was going to eat the kind of regular size bread as opposed to the thin sliced piece of bread, right? Like sometimes it's very little things which actually seem quite momentous to the child. But being able to sort of engage in an activity like that with the child and then have something tangible that you can each look at to really hold on to
Mm.
can be powerful, right? And that mother kept a jar of these paper hearts, right? And then
Oh.
that was a way to really just visually remember kind of these moments where there was growth or progress. I think that that can be really powerful, because otherwise it's so easy to just get caught up in what's going wrong. And if we take a more strength based approach, that benefits us as parents, but it also ultimately benefits the child as well.
Yeah, I know when I was going through everything with my son, I had what I call my God box, and I take like these tissue boxes that look like this, and I would decorate it, and I would just anything I needed to hand over, a person's name or whatever he was going through, and I would just put it in that box. And then after a certain amount of time, I would, look at it and see, what what happened and what was good. And if there was still stuff there, sometimes I would just burn it to just release it. Sometimes it's just doing some of those funky little things to change our perspective or get outside of the box of what we normally do. There's all those little quirky things that we can do to make it feel better. And I know when he came home from treatment, I had taken over his bedroom and I had all these I'd stenciled like faith, and I was just so desperate for that connection. And I'm not a religious person, but I'm spiritually connected, and I just it was it's what saved me, having that whatever it is, that power greater than me, and to take over. And when he came home from treatment, he walked into his room and he was like, what happened? He's 25 years old and it has faith and love. And I said, I'll paint it, I'll take care of it. He goes, no, you know what, leave it. I
Oh,
think
I
it'll
love
be good for me. So,
mm-hmm.
we all can find that little thing that just brings some light into our hearts, because
Yeah.
sometimes it can be pretty dark.
Yes, that's such a beautiful way of putting it. It reminds me of this quote that I came upon when I was looking at my childhood journals. And I was reading through these journals when I was writing the book, but there was one part where I had said, I don't deserve the light. And that was when I was in the throes of anorexia. And I just thought, oh, I just didn't care for myself at all. And I didn't really believe that I was deserving of anything besides the disorder. And I just think about how I wish I could go back and hug my younger self. But I also think about how I can let the light in so many more ways now.
And you still can. I don't think there's anybody in the world that doesn't need to do some inner child work. And we can still go in internally and love that little kid that is hurt, whether it's a teacher, a parent, or whatever. But everybody's carrying that load. And at some point we have to unpack it. And so what I do is when I work with parents, we do, if they're ready to heal. If they don't want to heal, we'll do the other stuff, but I have them write a letter to their inner child.
I love that. Such a great
and
idea.
and you answer both ways. So
Yeah.
mine's little D, and so just I just asked her what she needed, and we had this wonderful conversation, and I have it still in my journal. And but you get answers that you didn't know you needed sometimes when you do these little techniques to move forward in life and do the hard work and get to the why.
Yes, because sometimes we just didn't get parented in the ways that maybe we should have or wanted to have when we were little, or maybe we suffered a loss, right? And so I think about just all the ways that I wished I could have been mothered as a little girl who had lost her mom. And
Yeah.
I like to think about how I can do that in some ways, right? Just sort of think back to who I was and how those events shaped me, and also how I can honor that little girl who was doing the best, right, with the
Yeah.
resources that she had.
Yeah, she was in survival mode and her heart was broken
Yes.
to boot. That's a lot at 12.
Yes,
That's
definitely.
a lot, for any age, really.
Hmm.
When your heart's broken, it's
Yeah,
tough.
it is.
So as we wrap up, how do people get in touch with you?
So I have a contact form on my website, which is just my full name, Mallary Tenore Tarpley. That's a little bit of a mouthful, so maybe we can put it in the show notes, but it's
It'll be in the show notes.
MalloryTenoreTarpley.com. Yes. And then I do have a weekly newsletter where I focus on writing tips and I help people to figure out how to tell their stories. And that's just Mallory, Mallary .substack.com. So it's a free newsletter and people can check me out there. And then my book is available wherever you buy books, on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target's website. So the book, although focused on eating disorders, is also about loss and grief and parenthood. I also have a chapter looking at the overlap between substance abuse addiction and eating disorders. So I think that there's a lot of points of relatability in it for your listeners.
Nice. And it'll be available August 5th.
Yes. Yep. It's out for pre-order now. And then, yeah, it'll be in stores on the 5th, which is exciting.
Very exciting. So they can pre-order it on Amazon?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, awesome. Any words of wisdom you'd like to leave our listeners with?
So I would just say that it's important to think about more recovery. So that has been just a helpful shift for me to move from full recovery to more recovery, because more recovery could be 5% one day, it could be 10% the next. But the idea is that you are just sort of trying to move forward, right? And trying to aim for more recovery in your life, whatever that might look like. So I do think there's power in just expanding the language that we use to talk about recovery and to not just think of it in terms of black and white. So for me, this idea of the middle place and always striving for more recovery has been really helpful. And I hope others might find it helpful as well.
I love that. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you, and best of luck with moving forward with your book and everything that you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to support the Sharing Without Shame podcast, please subscribe, like, and leave a review. If you're in need of emotional support, Donna offers private sessions. For more information about Donna and the services she offers, visit www.sharingwithoutshame.com or email her at Donna4support@comcast.net. Nothing in the Sharing Without Shame podcast is intended to establish a therapist-patient relationship or intended to replace the services of a trained therapist, doctor, or health professional, or substitute for professional mental health, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Until next time, may your faith and strength heal your heart.